So my name is Paul Keller. I'm with Kennisland. Kennisland is a think tank in Amsterdam, and we work on issues globally related to what we call the knowledge economy or the knowledge society. That takes us into a lot of different areas, from education to government organization to organization of social services to digitization of cultural heritage. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about copyright for the past 10 years as well. For us, the internet has been something that has been extremely valuable and extremely important in shaping modern civil services, shaping a modern knowledge society. And we see copyright interfering, or copyright legislation, which is coming from, in its current form, in its basics, from basically the last century, as something which is throwing up a lot of barriers to that. So my title here is Nothing New Here. I was supposed to talk about recent copyright developments in the EU and the Netherlands. We've heard that there's a lot of things happening in Ireland and in a number of other countries. And the previous speaker, not previous speaker now, the speaker from Ireland referred a lot to cases for the Court of Justice for the European Union. So there's a lot of stuff going on at the Court of Justice for the European Union. Dutch courts regularly refer cases to the court in the last couple of years. And maybe that is an indication, or maybe that is a consequence from the fact that the underlying legal system hasn't changed that much, both in the Netherlands and in the European Union, and maybe I should have added copyright policy developments in the European Union here. That looked a little bit different. That's about the same time you referred to when you started your review. At the end of 2012, we had this, and I apologize for the Dutch, but this is actually a sentence from the coalition accord between the two, at that time two, now it's kind of like five, but not really five parties who formed the government here in this country. And they said something to the extent, as part of their coalition government, copyright law would be modernized so that justice will be done to the protection of creative expression without preventing the reuse possibilities, or without hindering the reuse possibilities of consumers. Around that same time, the European Commission, with a number of more words, so this round maybe goes to the Dutch government making the same promise with less words, set out something, and this was at the outset of the current round of discussions about copyright modernization at the European level, that the Commission will therefore work for a modern copyright framework that guarantees that balance which the Dutch government also talks about. So this is end of 2012, or second half of 2012, so roughly 2 years ago, when the situation actually looked like, or if you read these things and you hear there were things going on in Ireland, there were similar things going on in the UK, you would have had an impression that a lot would have happened by now, that the title I'm having here, that nothing has happened yet, or not much has happened yet, would be false. But yet we are here, we're finding ourselves at the end of 2014, and not a terrible lot has happened for the European Commission. That probably also means that the European Commission in its current form will not address copyright modernization in any form anymore. We expect the new Commission to be announced this week, and that's clearly a task for the new Commission. One thing which has happened, and that's been referenced to by the speaker from Ireland as well, is that the European Commission held a public consultation on a review of the copyright rules in Europe. And this public consultation, which was announced in November of last year and closed after 3 months in March of this year, got more than 11,000 answers to an 80 question, 45-page questionnaire. That is pretty crazy. If you look at, then this is an infographic which was produced by an MEP. If you look at other consultations, that's one of the biggest responses the European Union ever had on a consultation so far. You see two different shades of blue here, and the darker blue are consultations which require emailing a document. The other ones are ones which could be filled in online. And emailing documents, we have filled in a 40-page submission to that thing, and I know other people in this room who have worked on equally long things. So there's been a lot of input going in here, and there's 11,000 things, and it took them predictably a very, very long time to even analyze this thing. I think when they started having this consultation, they were probably hoping for a little bit less response so they could move quicker towards a phase where they could have something like a white paper or some other kind of legislative proposal. But as we've heard before, like the white paper is probably, or anything is probably not forthcoming during this term of the European Commission, and we're looking to see how that shapes after the new Commission takes reign. Again, this consultation, if you look at it from a substantial point of view, from the substance of the responses, there's nothing much new here. Like, I've tried to read not all 11,000, but I've read a fair share of those who I thought might be interesting me. And basically, it's stating obvious positions. Be that our own positions, it's basically restating what we've always stated. It's pretty much everybody else also stating what they always state, 11,000 times in like a horrible format. There is, however, and if you look at this, and at 11,000 answers that maybe become significant, we see like a very clear pattern in these things developing. This is a probably a little bit difficult to read infographic, or not really infographic, it's more a table, which was produced by Leonard Dobusch from a website called Governments Across Borders. And he took the pain of analyzing, and I don't know how he did this, but he has a spreadsheet behind that which is available from that website, where you can dive deeper into that. He took the pain in trying to graph general positions expressed in these responses. And if you look at this, it looks kind of like there's red over here, it's green over here, and there is yellow in the middle. And what that green basically means, green is people who said, like, we need some form of change. Red is people said, everything's fine here, we don't need change. And yellow is unclear. It's probably positions which wouldn't fall right in between the first two things, which is quite remarkable, because like the Commission had like 80 different questions in roughly, if you look at this is about 20 different categories, and you see that all these questions fall into the same category, or the answers to these questions fall on the same sites wherever you look. So this is a fairly split public, or at least that part of the public which reacted to that. It's maybe interesting, like use and interoperability of identifiers is the thing that everybody could agree on. So this was a question, would it be a good idea to have better things to identify copyrighted works, which is indeed very difficult probably to come up with an answer to, which is no, it's not a good idea. The rest is pretty much around, and this one question where this turns around, this is like which is the respect for rights, question 75 to 77, was something, the question was basically worded the other way around than you would have expected in this consultation. So this should be corrected, so that is green and that is red. And on the green hand side, if you look up there, there's end users and consumers and institutional users. So the green is the users, basically, those who are in the first instance identifying as people who are using copyrighted works created by others. And on the red side, we have authors, performers, collective management organizations, which is basically, well, kind of like the same, because the one are the representatives of the other ones, and publishers, producers, and broadcasters. So this is basically all the people and organizations who make their money by producing and then distributing copyrighted works. Here's another way of looking at this thing. This tries to bring into like the amount of responses received. So we see that the majority of responses in this entire thing was received from that user side, who are crying out and saying, like, we need some form of reform. These 2001 copyright laws don't work that well anymore for the reality we find ourselves into 2014. And the other ones say, like, keep the status quo. Now, this is a very interesting situation. If you're somehow in a policy background, you can see that these people have a slight advantage, because it's usually easier to prevent action than to initiate action. If you look at the European project, initiating some form reform of a major part of European legislation is a multi-year process, which involves talking to lots of stakeholders, which can take very long. The previous Commission obviously had failed in doing anything about this, and it's very easy to block this thing. On the other hand, we're in a situation, and the speaker from Ireland made a reference to fair use here, that we have on this side, keep the status quo, people who are benefiting from a general principle, and that is it's the exclusive right of the author, or like those who obtain that right, to do something with copyrighted work, to make it public or to distribute it, And on this side, in the European thing, we have a list of very clearly defined exceptions to that rule. So this general principle will stay the same, and it kind of like expanded. If something new comes along, this general principle will expand and probably cover this. Maybe in some cases it doesn't cover this, but it's a flexible thing on this side. Whereas on this thing, if you're not with something you want to do on this list of exceptions and limitations, then by waiting it out, you won't come on this list of exceptions and limitations. And that's a little bit different than the situation, for example, in the US you find yourself in, because in the US they have kind of two competing principles. You have a principle which is the same, like the protection in the first place goes to the authors and the creators and those who are authorized by them. But on the other hand, you have also a general principle. There is something called fair use, and that is not listed in 21 or how many different articles in the law, but that is a general principle, and that also expands. So the European system is a little bit less good at adapting to changes in technology and changes in reality in that sense. And I would argue this makes it more important that we act on the copyright reform now, because you hear a lot of people, and you heard that was a conclusion in Ireland as well, this American legal tradition of having this flexible norm and then having that interpreted by the courts may not work so well in the European Union. And if you agree with that thing, then I would argue for policymakers, both in Brussels but also in the Netherlands, it is important that you look at that list of exceptions and limitations once in a while and see, does that still fit the needs of society? And if it doesn't, do something about that. And the problem is, since 2001, nobody has done that anymore. And I don't need to explain to people in this room what has happened in terms of technology and distribution since 2001. Basically everything we're talking about here today has come into existence since then. So this is really this enormous public interest for this consultation, together with this kind of like inflexibility of the system, really is something which is crying for action from lawmakers both in Europe and the Netherlands, and they would be good to look back at these statements which I've showed at the beginning and actually act on them. And really quickly, one thing from my perspective, or from Kennisland's perspective, what do we think, what needs to be done? We think like a more modern, from our experience, a more modern copyright system needs at least provide room for citizens to produce and interact with their culture. And for example, that touches on issues like user-generated content, but also non-commercial sharing of stuff. And we have a very sensible proposal by the Dutch Copyright Council on the table, which hasn't been answered, where they say, like, if you expand the scope created by the citation exception in Dutch law, you can actually enable people not to interact only with textual works, but also with audiovisual works, and make this work a little bit better. That has been, I'm not aware of an answer, and that's been lying there for 1.5 years or something. The other thing is enable public institutions to do what they are supposed to do online. We hear from libraries, we're involved in lots of digitization projects, that it's extremely difficult for these people who spend enormous amounts of public taxpayer money in preserving collections, and they see the internet coming and they think, well, that's a good idea, there's stuff that nobody really wants to, or not a lot of people want to look at. The economies of scale of the internet allow us to make that available in the first place and let people access this stuff without coming to The Hague, to the building of the National Library or the National Archive or a museum or something. But this isn't possible at the moment. Like, the exceptions and limitations relevant still talk about dedicated terminals on the premises of the institutions. I haven't seen a lot of dedicated terminals in the last, and probably everybody here has a undedicated terminal for that in their pocket, and maybe even two. The other thing is, think about term duration and unwanted unused protections we're all creating at the moment. We're all getting 70 years of copyright protections, and a lot of people may not need it, may not want it, so you may want to think about something that you actually register for extra levels of protection for copyrighted work. And finally, and that is, again, a European point, ensure that this is the same wherever you go in Europe. It's very difficult for people to understand why they have to deal with different rules when it comes to, like, the online environment in each and every European country, whereas we're trying so hard to harmonize the rules when it comes to lots of physical markets in the European Union. That's just, it's difficult to grasp and difficult to understand and explain to people who are trying to get active in this market. thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'm not allowed, I now know to ask leading questions, so I'm not asking you how frustrated you are, but how do you feel? This slide.
Well, my presentation template limits me to four bullet points here, and I'm actually, like most of the people who work on Wikipedia that I personally know happen to be citizens most of one country or another, and in Europe probably. So I think you fit in between those two. I think it's interesting to look at something where, like, taking Wikipedia and cultural heritage institutions, right? Like, cultural heritage is something we've sunk enormous amounts of money into to preserve our common heritage as Europe, and that's something we as Europeans have been terribly good in. Like, people come from all over the world to visit our museums and our archives and the libraries, and we are shackling them for no good reason. And at the same point, we're seeing, like, who becomes the go-to resource for people wanting to find information about, a lot of it is about history or shared culture. That's Wikipedia. So at some point, like, this undermines the rationale of funding these institutions. Maybe we should just fund Wikipedia because we've decided what these museums have done that somehow shall not exist in the online environment.
But if you go to Wikipedia today, Wikipedia will ask you to help fund Wikipedia. I think for $2 a month or something, you help them through the winter.
Oh yeah, I already paid, so it doesn't ask me anymore.
Okay. Oh, that's good. That's a good system. Most of the time, the internet doesn't work that way. Most of the time, it keeps asking you because of that. Other questions?
Yeah, I had a question. I'm not sure if you're the right person to ask it to, but I'll just try anyways. My name is Gabriella Krapels. I work at the Ministry of Economic Affairs. I was wondering, have you ever thought about maybe quantifying the economic costs of remaining in the status quo as we are today? For both, well, actually for consumers, I guess.
I've thought about many times. Unfortunately, that is something I'm not trained to do, and I think it's very difficult to. It's a very difficult problem. And there is certainly, like, you probably can't do this on the overall scale and say, like, doing nothing costs us X and doing this will magically solve everything. So I think you need to look at specific sectors and specific problems when you ask these questions. And I think there's been, and maybe you're the better person to answer, like, I think for some of the sectors this has been done. We see a lot of frankly misleading studies at the moment which claim, like, copyright industries are responsible for this much of the economy, and then somebody else comes and says it's not true. And I think to a big degree, like, lots of these exceptions and limitations which we had in the past, like, they weren't created because it was economically good. Nobody went in the past and said, like, to the publishers and said, would you like us to have a library system so that people can lend books for free? There is, like, a vision of society which is inclusive behind some of these things, which says it's good that people can have access, even those who can't pay for books, like, have access to their culture, and therefore we want to have libraries. If we want to have functioning libraries, we need exceptions to copyright in this place. So I think there is reasons for economic analysis on different sectors, but it cannot be the only reason for doing something or not doing something. Some of the stuff, for example, the same with user-generated content. I am of the opinion that the freedom of expression, and that we allow people and that we allow citizens to express themselves in the medium that they are comfortable with. And let's face it, like, a lot of young people are better at making long-form music or long-form video than long-form writing. We should allow them to express themselves in this medium, even if that infringes or even if that touches a little bit on the exclusive control of authors.